If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Philippians chapter 2. This is where we'll spend our time. A couple of weeks ago, just for anybody who wasn't here, or if you're like me, don't remember, we looked at Romans chapter 1. And in it, we looked at the human condition as the Bible would have the human condition to be, which is the condition of being fallen. A condition wherein in ourselves we are unable to live in the way that God prescribed for us to live, except in pockets. Most of the time we are failing in that. And there's a clue. As we come up on Thanksgiving, I thought to myself, there's a clue in that text. If you go back and read Romans 1, we didn't acknowledge God as God, and he says in verse 21, and neither were we thankful. That is a gigantic statement. The thankfulness aspect of it. Think about it from the standpoint of somebody who doesn't believe that God exists. And there are lots of people like that. I mean, I would say the majority of the people in this country today, they may think that, oh yes, I believe that there's some kind of God, but they have no relationship with him. They don't think about the gospel. They have no intimate connection where the Spirit of God is living in them. So saying that I believe he's there makes them no better, as James says, than the demons who believe, right? They're afraid of him. So in that, if there is no God, then who in the world are we thankful toward? Think about that for a minute. I mean, a person can only be thankful to a reflective ego. In other words, if Eddie helps me change my tire because I've broken down on the side of the road, I'm thankful to Eddie for helping me change my tire. But the fact, as G.K. Chesterton says, that I wake up, he says, and somebody puts oranges in my stocking on Christmas, I'm thankful and I know who to thank. But the fact that I wake up and put 2 feet into my own stockings, who do I thank then? Right? Who are we thankful toward? And Paul links thankfulness to this idea of not knowing God and says the two go hand in hand. So let's think about that for a minute as we look at this text. Philippians chapter 2, I'll begin reading in verse 12. So then, my dear friends, just as you have obeyed, not only in my presence, but even more so in my absence, continue working out your own salvation with fear and with reverence. For the one bringing forth in you both the desire and the effort to work your salvation out for the sake of his good pleasure is God. Do everything without grumbling or complaining or arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God, without blemish, though you live in a crooked and perverse society in which you shine as lights in the world, by holding on to the word of life, so that on the day of Christ I will have a reason to brag that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice together with all of you. And in the same way, you should be glad and rejoice together with me. So let's think about this text for just a minute. There are a couple of things here in this text that are very theological, and there are a couple of things that are very historical, and both of them are important. The theological contains 2 threads here, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. I'm sure you have, some of you, that Paul says 2 things in one little sentence. He tells us, you and me, that we who follow Jesus sort of work out our own salvation. That's a very curious statement. But then he says, for it is God who works in you and me to not only cause us to want to work it out, but then gives us the capacity to do so. I mean, that's a fascinating statement. So you've got now the sovereignty of God coupled up with human choosing, all in one little sentence. Very deep theological portion of this text. And he clearly points to both things, right? You and I have to work out our salvation, which means we have to make choices about it. And we're empowered to do so. But God is also working, enabling us to make those choices. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, I thought about this. Have you ever thought about some of the words we use are really weird? Scissors. Scissors. Now, how many scissors are there? Right? If somebody says, hand me the pair of scissors, I'm thinking there's only one scissors. There's only one thing. We have a set at our house where they come apart. It's some kitchen scissors, and you can take the two halves. Of course, and I think myself to at least have a modicum of intellectual capacity. Now, maybe not a whole lot, but some. And some common sense. And when I grab those scissors to try to put those things back together, I'll turn them every way from Sunday to try to figure out how they fit so that they become scissors once again. You can't have just one sizz, right? Or one sores. You have to have the pair, the two things. C.S. Lewis says that's exactly what this passage would tell us. The two things go together. The two poles of God's sovereignty and our choice are held in tension in the Bible, and they are not resolved. They are both true at the same time, like scissors. Scissors don't work when you've only got half of them. Now, this letter, historically, is one of Paul's prison epistles. It's one that we think, from the record of the text, if you go back and read from chapter 1 forward, you'll see that he is in prison. And it's interesting that he writes this to this congregation in Philippi because there is no synagogue in Philippi at this point in history. There are Jews there. I'm sure there's some Jews living there, just like you have Jews living in America. They don't all live in Israel, right? But there's no synagogue. So he's writing to a Gentile audience here entirely when he composes this letter. And he's in prison, and you remember when Silas and he were traveling, they were put into what was called the inner stocks, the inner prison, the inner chamber of the prison. It's translated different ways in Acts chapter 16 on Paul's second missionary trip. These prisons were terrible places. They were just terrible. I mean, we've talked about it before. It's a good thing to get a good Bible dictionary and look up the Mamertine prison and what it was like. I mean, you were literally in a hole. There was no light, no windows. You couldn't see out. You were chained to the wall. You could move maybe 2 feet in any one direction, and that was it. Your chains were just long enough so that you could bring food up to your mouth if they fed you. And of course, everything your body did was right there with you all the time. It was terrible, terrible. They didn't put people in prison in the Roman Empire to await a trial. They put them there hoping that they would just simply die there, and the Roman Empire would have one less person to deal with. Prison was almost a death sentence in the Roman Empire. So Paul, as he's writing this, if I'm understanding the text correctly, seems to think that he's awaiting execution after prison. Whether the prison conditions do it or he's taken out and killed, he's awaiting execution, he thinks. And this explains, I think, the early parts of the text. So here you've got a person with his eyes wide open to the conditions. He knows where he is, he knows why he's there, he knows what's going on, and yet he's talking to this church about their need to be thankful. Man, what a perspective shift this text is from the kind of way in which I look at life. I look at life as, gosh, I want it to be a good one. Paul looks at life as just the continuum of walking before God, and whatever comes, comes, and I'm going to be thankful in it no matter what. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Now, how is it such a big deal? What's wrong with you or me, any of us, that this would be a big deal, that we would be thankful in all things? How is it that that's a big deal? Well, it's got everything to do with our culture. We live in the culture of rights, right? We've got a Bill of Rights. I'm not criticizing it. I think it's great. I mean, we structured our culture on the idea that God has built human beings with intrinsic rights that are just part of who we are. There's part of that I completely agree with. But there's also an effect in thinking about things in terms of rights that gives us a lot of trouble when it comes to being thankful. And that is, the Bible doesn't know much about rights. It knows about duties. That's what the Bible's concentrating upon, is duty. We use two words in our language right now, liberal and conservative. We use them completely improperly. Just got to say that. Anybody who knows anything about American history knows this to be true. George Washington was a liberal. Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, go all the way back to the founders, Franklin, Adams, they were liberals. What did they want? They wanted liberty. That's where the word comes from. Who were the conservatives? During the Revolutionary period, those were the people who wanted King George to sit on the throne and us to be a colony. Today, we look at this completely upside down. The liberals are those who want to impose a kind of a totalitarian situation upon us all, and the conservatives are those who want to see liberty. Well, both sides of this equation in our culture have great merit, and both sides have great liabilities in both directions. They both flow from the fact that this culture no longer has any clear purpose for being here. Now, when the culture was founded, Franklin and the rest of the group, they understood exactly what they were trying to achieve. They were trying to achieve liberty. And they wanted a nation wherein the people would govern themselves to a large degree. So they had a very clear purpose for the nation. That's long gone for us here. But we still have and cling to it tenaciously, the idea of rights. And no matter which side of the political spectrum a person is on, they are clinging to rights in some measure, no matter what it is they think. Even those who would seem to think things need to be mandated by the government, they're only doing that because they think that somehow if they're not mandated, their rights will be infringed upon by those who don't obey the mandate. So it's all connected to this idea of rights. The Bible knows something very different. The Bible knows something about virtue as a culture, as a cultural norm. Did you know, I don't know which founder it was, maybe Colin knows, I wish I could remember. One of the founders said, it might have even been George Washington, I cannot remember. They said, if we do not have a population that is virtuous, this experiment is going to fail. Virtue was the grounding for it. In other words, if we're not virtuous people, then there's nothing to point to that says we should behave in any sort of way particularly, and everybody's just on their own to make it up for themselves. Virtue implies something that goes right back to the Creator, and that is that there's really a way things ought to be in the world. And the virtuous are living closer to that way things ought to be than the non-virtuous. We have within our very culture the idea that life, liberty, and what? The pursuit of happiness. Did you know that's an impossible task? Who can pursue happiness? Nobody. What do? We pursue things that we think will make us happy, right? And that goes across the board, whether one is, in our modern nomenclature, liberal or conservative. Everybody's pursuing what they think will make them happy. And they're doing so on the basis of rights. And this has filtered down into this culture to the point where now we have complete confusion between two very different things, needs and wants. Think about that for a minute. Wants, I don't know about any of you in here, I'm sure some of you remember this. When I came up in grade school, there were people, all the way through till I was in high school, there were people in our school who I went to school with who had no telephone in their home. Right? Telephone was, at that time, was not a need. Didn't need it. Now, everybody needs a cell phone, and a smartphone at that. So our whole structure of economy has been built on the idea that a want becomes a need. Think about a car. Used to, and you can still visit places in Europe like this where people's whole life is in a walking distance. They can walk to the market, they can walk everywhere they need to go. They don't have to have a car, they're right there. The clothing store, the food store, everything is available in a walk. I remember when Becky and I lived in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, it was close to that kind of little village. There were sandwich shops you could walk to. There were clothing stores you could walk to. Even if you really wanted to take a long walk and you had a wagon, you could go to the grocery store if you wanted to, as long as you didn't have anything frozen. Probably wouldn't make it home in the summertime with some of that. But what I'm getting at is this idea now creates a sense of frustration in us that changes the way this culture is, and there's only one way to resolve it. So we think, and that's governmental power. That's how we fix things. That's how we solve this problem. Well, we are followers of Jesus. We're supposed to be, right? And so we have something that rises above all that as a clear purpose if we're willing to accept it. We're supposed to, according to this text, read it again, to display something different to this world. We're supposed to be lights, as Paul says it, in this perverse world. And he's making a real linkage here, as he did in Romans 1. The linkage is between a darkened heart and being not thankful. Those two things go absolutely hand in hand. Dark hearts think of life as that which just comes to them by chance, and it has no meaning whatsoever in the ultimate sense, because life is not going anywhere for a darkened heart. I remember Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche's a funny person to quote in a church setting since he was an atheist, but he was pretty smart. He said this: a person can endure many a what if they know why. God gives us the why. We're here to be lights in this perverse world. So when we have to endure something, there's a why connected to the what. And it's a deep why. I have a friend who died in the last 3 or 4 years. Well, let's see. 5 years, 6 years. And I remember very close to me person in Pennsylvania. I couldn't go to the funeral. I couldn't get there. But I remember talking to him when he was diagnosed. And he said, it's the most amazing thing. Stop and consider what this means when you know that you've got something that's apt to kill you. He says, this is my journey now. That's somebody who knows Jesus that's going to talk like that. This is my journey now. In other words, my life may be short, but it's going somewhere. I'm here for a purpose. And what might be that purpose? Maybe it's to be lights in the world while you're dying. Wow. Paul says to the church at Thessaloniki, in everything, give thanks. I'm just going to say, for me, that's an extremely tall order. I would admit that to anybody. My wife knows well enough that I don't give thanks for everything. There are things I go through, we go through, our family goes through, somebody I love goes through. I'm not thankful they're going through it. He says, "Given everything, give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Man. So the implication is we choose it, right? We're choosing these things. That's how we work out our own salvation in fear and trembling. We choose. It's not our natural default posture at all. It's certainly not mine. Maybe it's some of yours, but it is not mine. I have to choose it. I have to be intentional about it. But it points to something, doesn't it? It points to the distinction between a changed person and an unchanged person. Think about the descriptions that the Bible gives in terms of a changed person's thoughts about God. Let me just give you a list of some of the words I find in the Bible when a person talks about God. Yearning, panting, waiting, longing, looking, watching, desiring, reaching. All of those are the words that the Bible uses to describe our hearts toward God once they're changed. Because the people who wrote those things, they were changed people. G.K. Chesterton said, well, we're not weary of pain. We're weary of pleasure. I think he's right. Because of all the things that the pleasure makes us chase, we cannot pursue happiness as a goal. It's not possible. I remember when I was in school in the 6th grade, I had a teacher. This teacher, she was both a great teacher and a maniac at the same time. She would put up with us misbehaving to a certain point, and when the calamity got to a certain level, she became a maniac. She screamed so loud, and I mean, when somebody screams and their voice completely breaks up because they're just at a volume level that is no longer, the capacity of their vocal cords has completely been exceeded. You know, it's just a weird sound. That's exactly how she sounded. She sounded like a rock and roll singer when they screamed. And it was just super loud. Her face was red. She wasn't really looking at anybody when she did it. But what she used to do that I loved was for an hour, every day I was in the 6th grade, she read to us from Greek mythology. She read to us the Iliad and the Odyssey. Every day. One Greek myth tells the story of a king whose name was Tantalus. Tantalus stole ambrosia. Now, ambrosia is something that only the gods on Olympus could drink. And if you stole it, you were in trouble if you were immortal. So he stole it. For his punishment, they sent him to this beautiful garden, an Eden. And when he was in there, there was this pool of, he got there and he thought, wow, what a punishment. You know, it's like somebody who's got all kinds of fun things in their room, a kid, and you condemn them to their bedroom, and they think, you know, who's worried about that? I'm in the best place I could be. It's like condemning them to the ice cream parlor. Well, he was condemned to this garden, and it was this beautiful pool of clear water. And when he went down to drink it, the water would dive down underneath where he couldn't reach it with his hands. And there were these fruits growing all over the trees that were just beautiful, and you knew you could eat them. And when he reached for them, the limbs of the trees would lift up and he couldn't reach them. That's where we get the word tantalized from. King Tantalus was tantalized, but he was never satisfied. We live in a culture right now that I think contains both elements of both Orwell and Huxley. George Orwell's Brave New World, the totalitarian regime where you're told what to think and how to think about it, and everything is controlled. And also Aldous Huxley's world, where you're given a drug that just numbs you to everything and you're made passive by the fact of being so happy you don't think of anything going wrong, you don't think of anything you're dissatisfied with. We live in both. Let's compare that to this. I read this in one of these little Christian books, like a guidepost or something. Think about this and think about the idea of being thankful as we come up on Thanksgiving. The story told of the Oregon Trail travelers. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know if you've ever read anything about the people who traveled west, these people who were just common people. They weren't survivalists. And they traveled with just incredible dangers all around them, but they did it. I think, wow, who would load up all their little itty-bitty children and put them in a wagon and head out across a dangerous passage going 3 or 4 miles an hour for weeks and weeks, months on end, wondering if I'm going to make it past this before winter? And they did that. And these group of people on the Oregon Trail had gotten to the place where they were starting to really complain to the trail boss about the fact they didn't have enough water, they didn't have enough provisions, they hadn't stopped in enough places to replenish their stores, their animals needed fodder. What are we going to do? And they had all gotten together in this little group. They were going to complain to the trail boss at a meeting they were going to have that night. So when they got done eating around the campfire, it was time to load in and let's go after the trail boss. We're loaded for bear. Well, some settler said, you know, before we start this meeting, let's pray. And so they did. The settler prayed this way: Lord, we thank you that we're alive and that we've come this far and we haven't encountered deadly circumstances of weather. We haven't encountered deadly encounters with Indians. And here we are this far along this trail. Thank you for that. And they got done praying. Well, guess what? The only complaints after that were the crickets and the fire crackling. Nobody had any complaints after that. They realized they were thankful. I went to Walmart this week. We made another trip last night to get a prescription filled. I'm not going to die or anything, so I can do without it, but even so, after 3 or 4 trips, you start to get kind of weary of going to Walmart for the one thing and coming away disappointed. I I was going into Walmart on Friday to do what I was told by the doctor's office, pick up your prescription, it's ready. Of course, I got there and that was not the case. But as I was going in, I passed a guy sitting outside his car in a wheelchair. And you know, all the idea of being inconvenienced left me. Because I just thought, and I say this with reverence, I'm not him. There's so much to be thankful for. And it seems to me that God wants us not to be thankful to please him, but to be thankful because it's better for us. It's better for us. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.